Well, good morning, and we are continuing to adventure our way through the book of Hebrews. And so we come to probably what is the, I would probably guess to be the second most famous chapter in the book of Hebrews. And it's my greatest regret that we have to do it all in one morning, because you could spend probably 6 months looking at chapter 4 today. So we're going to take a look at that. It's just a fantastic chapter. So here's our overlook. Remember, there's 13 chapters. The first 4, roughly, we're talking about the identity of who Jesus is, Yeshua is. And then today we'll actually start to migrate into his work through the center section. And by the way, the dominant theme about Yeshua's work, Jesus' work, is as a high priest for us. And a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So if you come from a LDS background, you'll really be interested in the next several weeks, because through the month of February, pretty much Melchizedek. Melchizedek's interesting. Just to give you a preview, we see him do kind of a cameo appearance in Genesis, really short with Abraham. We hear his name mentioned in Psalm 110 to connect him to the Messiah, and then he's not mentioned anywhere else in the entire Bible until you get to this section in Hebrews. This is the whole thing. So anyway, it's kind of interesting. So we're in chapter 4. Got stuck. I go over there. Oh, he's a little confused today. Okay, yep, we're in chapter 4. That's a little silliness right there. Yeah, you got there. Okay, and we need to remember, like we did last week, this pivot between the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4 is a big deal. So let me read for you the last verse in chapter 3, and here it is, verse 19. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. And I asked you as we left last week to say, well, what is that unbelief? What did they not believe? And the they we're talking about is the Israelites as they left the captivity in Egypt. And they went toward the promised land. They got to the edge of it, and they didn't believe. How can you not believe that God has given you that? So we're going to look at that more closely today, because this is actually part B from last week, being part A. This is part B. How can you find yourself at the doorstep of the promised land after seeing all the miracles you saw, leaving Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and being fed in the desert, and you get right up to the doorstep and go, I don't think so. What? How is that possible? So we're going to look at that in more detail today. And incredible stuff. So here's our historical review. This is a view from space, Google Earth. Woo, we love Google Earth. That big green thing on the left is the Nile Delta fan. That's present-day Egypt. And you see the yellow lines are the present national boundaries between countries. Israel is in the center over there. So we put right here, there's the Israelites. They are captive in Egypt. We're going to wind it back. 400 years, they're there as slaves of the Egyptians. And then way down here, little green dot, that's Moses. He's out there running away from the entire situation. He's tending sheep, and God says, Moses, I need you to go back and be useful to me to free my people. So he leaves his sheep over there in Midian and comes, and he joins up with the Israelites, his people, back in Egypt. And remember, he goes before Pharaoh. You know the story, right? And they're freed, and all the 10 plagues and stuff like that, and they leave Egypt, and this will follow them. This is like the traditional path of where we think they went. They cross the Red Sea, woo! And they come around the Sinai Peninsula, come past the Mount Sinai where you get the 10 Commandments, and up into the desert lower parts of Israel is where they're there. That maybe took them 2 weeks, tops, 2 weeks. And so now they're right on the brink of going into the best part of Israel, the part that's flowing with milk and honey. They're in the desert area, in the Negev right now, and as they're there, they decide what they're going to do is they're going to get a sneak peek. So they send in spies, and the spies go up, one for every tribe, so there's 12 of them. They check out the best stuff, and they say, hey, great things, and then they come back, and they bring a report to the nation of Israel, and they tell what it is that they found, all right? So let's go to the report and see what they said. So where we're going is Numbers 13 and verse 27. Thus they told him, and they said, and here's their story, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Actually, it doesn't really flow with milk and honey. That's a metaphor. We do take the Bible literally, but that's just a figure of speech. It means that it's full of fat, wonderful, luxurious food. Okay, it's just a wonderful place. And it also has, this is its fruit. We know that from the account that they brought back a bunch of grapes, and it was so big that you don't, like out of the grocery store, you don't just carry it like this. They had to put it on a pole between 2 guys. and carried. It was just like a gigantic amount. And they said, look, and this is the fruit. Good news. Well, not exactly. Verse 28, nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified, which means they have big walls, and they're very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And when you hear Anak, you should hear background music go, dun, dun, dun. Anak is a family name for the giants that lived in the land. And real guys. They have found archaeological remains of 10-foot-long beds in Israel. So kind of a distant relatives of Goliath is what we're talking about. So they said, we went there and we saw giants. Okay, so it's looking kind of bleak. Verse 29, Amalek is living in the land. If you remember the Amalekites, the Amalekites were always nipping on the heels of Israel as they were going around. They're just longtime enemies. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev. And the Hittites and the Jebusites. Originally, Jerusalem was inhabited by the Jebusites, and so Jerusalem was called Jebus. So they're saying there's Jebusites there, and the Amorites, they're all living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living there as well. And they go on. The Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. So, yes, there's good stuff in the land, but nevertheless, there's bad guys. Bad guys so bad that we're completely outclassed. Now you got to remember, Israel is not a military fighting force at this point in time. Present-day Israel is the smartest, best defensive forces in the entire Middle East. Just extraordinary. But at this time, they're 2 weeks out of being slaves in Egypt. They are not a trained fighting force. They go in, they see the land, they see these peoples, they say, we haven't got a chance. Big fortified cities. I mean, think places like Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Big fortified cities, huge walls. And if they're big, not only are they fortified, if they're big enough, they have enough people living in the middle of them that have swords that even if we do get through the walls, how are we going to take them? So the place is full of fortified cities, and that's true. So these things are all really true, and they bring back a negative report. So the writer of Hebrews comes back to this and says, listen, chapter 4, verse 1, therefore let us fear, if while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, yes, just as they also, and he's talking about the Israelites, just as they also had, but the word they heard did not profit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. So he's tying our walk of faith with Jesus and toward heaven, he's tying that together with the Israelites' experience and saying, look, remember, they had a promise. After all, the land they were going to was called the Promised Land. Exactly. God had promised this to them. So he's saying, don't forget, they had a promise. The promise remained that God was going to give them that land. But they got up to the edge of it and failed. We too, he says, have had good news preached to us. So before you get cocky and think everything's automatic, remember, if they had such a good promise to them and they failed, the same thing might happen to you. And not because the promise is bad, but because of you. So let's look at that a little bit, he says. In fact, as we go back to the example, back in Exodus of Moses leading the people away, he says, what was the promise they were given? Well, we'll take a look. So here's the good news that they had preached to them. So we go back again to the account. Got to wind the time back. Okay, we're back over here. And let's listen to the promise that they got while they were over there in Egypt through the mouth of Moses. And this is what he said in Exodus 6. God sends Moses back to the land where the people are still in captivity, where they're not out in this part of the story, Exodus 6. God spoke further to Moses and said to Moses, okay, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, which is in English is the El Shaddai, that's his name, the powerful one. But my name, Lord, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. But I established my covenant with them, that's my promise, to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. So he starts and says, Canaan, remember that land? That 400 years prior, before they became slaves, you know, the early tribes of Israel, remember back there? I told them, this is your land. I'm giving it to you. And although you've been for several generations in Egypt, I'm still giving it to you. So he's saying, don't forget, that promise still remains. And he goes on. And I wanted to emphasize this. He says that God's the one who's going to give it to them. He's not going to provide them a plan that they can earn it. God just says, I'm giving it to them. It's all God's initiative. He goes on in the promise in verse 5 of Exodus 6. Furthermore, God speaking, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. The covenant being the promised land. Okay, so I remember my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel. So here's what he wants Moses to get up there and remind them of the promise. And here's the promise. He says this. Tell them this. I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And before we what God wants Moses to say, did you notice how many times he says, God in the first person says, I will? There's one. I will bring you out, and I will deliver you from and I will redeem you from then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out. That's a lot of I wills. It's not a lot of Israel, you will. It's God saying, I will. This is a total unilateral promise. God saying, this is what I will do. And he goes on and says, Moses, tell him the rest of this. Verse 8, I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. See, the promise remains. And I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So there are a couple more I wills. I will bring you out of the land. It's not that you're going to fight your way out. I'm not going to come someday with truckloads full of AK-47s and you'll fight your way out of the Egyptians. No, I will get you out. I. So don't make any mistake who did this. I will get you out, which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise of the promised land. And I will give it to you for a possession, an inheritance. So remember that land that I promised to Abraham? Yeah. And to his son and to his grandson and then to the tribe. Remember that promise I made? Yeah. Okay, remember that promise? Well, those guys only lived there in tents. They didn't really fully live there. They were there for a while, and then, the food got short, and they went down to Egypt, and Joseph, you know that whole story, and suddenly they were out of land. But your ancestors, he said, that I promised this land, they only lived there in tents. But now I'm going to give it to you as a possession, as an inheritance. You're going to get it in full. Same promise I made to your forefathers, that promise still remains. So while a promise remains, be careful you don't fall short of it. That's what he's saying, this promise. He goes on. This is what the response was, verse 9 of Exodus 6. So Moses spoke thus to the sons of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and their cruel bondage. What? What? So Moses gets up there and speaks for God. God's promise continues that he made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to all. The promise remains, and I will bring you out of Egypt, and I will free you from it, and I will bring you to this land. I will. And they go, I don't think so. And why? Well, you have to look a little earlier in Exodus 6. Because Moses started to give the message and brought it to Pharaoh. And because Pharaoh said, oh, yeah, well, we'll see. And then it turned out that Pharaoh heaped on even more work for them to do. So they were bummed because it looks like Moses has come in and all he's done is stir up the muck and made life harder for us. So when Moses got up at this point and said, this is what God will do, they said, thanks, you're not helping at all so far. You're just making life harder. Now, you have to understand we're getting a glimpse, an early glimpse into the real hearts of these Israelites. Because when they get to the edge of the promised land, these hearts will prevail. We'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, verse 19 of Hebrews 3. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So let's start to answer the question. What did they not believe? Okay, good first step, that they would inherit the land. They just didn't believe the promise, right? God said, I'm going to take you there. They said, I don't think so. Here's what they believed, that the promise is a lie. God makes this promise, not only just to them through Moses, but to their ancestors. And they're saying, that's no promise. God's lying. God's lying. Well, they didn't say that, but they sure did it in their actions. God's promise, is it a promise? That's what they didn't believe. They didn't believe that the promise was real. Now, take that one step further. This is a little bit of godly speculation. If you don't believe that God's promise of life in the promised land is true, then what is it you are now believing about God himself? That he can't, number one. That could either be that or that he won't. Either can't or he won't. One of those two things. Now, I would maintain that after they go through the Red Sea and after they do all this stuff, it's not going to ever be an issue of God can't. Right? I mean, just the plagues to get them out of Egypt. God can. So if he brings us up to the edge of the promised land and we don't believe, then what we're saying is that God won't. And what does it say about God's impression about us? God doesn't care about us. He made a promise, but I can't trust him. He doesn't care about us. We're here in the bondage of Egypt, probably be here forever. The promise does not remain. He's lying to us. He doesn't care about us. In fact, the early revelation of this plan that God had that Moses has brought to Pharaoh has just made our life harder. So not only does God not care about us, but God's actually cruel to us. Because he's telling us these things. I'll get you out, but he doesn't really intend to do it. You see what not believing that promise says about who you think God is? Now, some of them could have stood and said, but God made the promise, and God is faithful, and God will bring it about. Yay! And they understand something about God, right? Or you can have the other side who stand here and say, God's lying to us. He didn't fulfill the promise to our forefathers. He's not going to fulfill our promise to us. The promise is a sham. There really is no promise. God's just jerking us around. And God doesn't really love us. That's what it really says. God really doesn't care. So this is an issue that reflects on their heart for who God is. Not just the fact of whether he can or cannot do his promises, but God just doesn't care about us because God is capable of doing this. See? That's the disconnect I want you to start to see. The disconnect between the people of God and their God. They're saying, we just don't think he will. Maybe he's not faithful. Maybe he's gone asleep and he's on the other side of the universe. He just doesn't care. We're all on our own. He calls us his people, but he's not acting like our God. Forget him. So their hearts are already disconnected from him. That's what they don't believe right there. They fundamentally don't believe in who God is as being a compassionate, loving God who sees their situation as concerned for them and wants to change that. They don't think that's who God is. Now, to be fair, 400 years in slavery in Egypt will do that to you. I mean, after all, the forefathers before that, Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and had the 12 sons and the 12 tribes, and then before him Isaac and before him Abraham. Okay, they were cool guys and they seemed to walk with God. But hey, it's been 400 stinking years that we've been in prison to the Egyptians. So don't talk to me about God's promises. Now, I'm not letting them off the hook, but I'm just telling you, they had a human context that we forget about, and we have a human context that we'll start wagging our finger at God and say, well, you don't understand what I've gone through. I'm not sure God is compassionate anymore toward me, because let me tell you about my last 400 years. So the human condition is pretty similar here, so don't get too tough on them unless you want to start getting tough on you, because we do the same thing. So they're struggling with this. Let's see what happens. Verse 2 of Hebrews 4. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard, it did not profit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. This is the beginning of one of the best passages on faith in the whole Bible. Okay, so you see what he's saying? The promise they heard, I will take you to the promised land. They heard that. Did their ears hear that? Yes, their ears heard that. But it somehow didn't get past the hearing and into the action of the heart belief. And he says the reason is because it was not united with faith. So it wasn't a failure to hear. It was a failure in faith. So let's look at it for a second. Now let me draw you a picture. Over here we have your past, and over here we have your future. There's a gap between your past and your future. And when we try and figure out what the pathway is between those two, for many of us, it's just a big old blue cloud. I know what happens today, and I know what's happened in the past. I can tell you about my past. But my future, what it's going to be and how I'm going to get there, I don't know. So there's always a question in our mind about how we're going to get there. What's the path we're going to take to our future, and what's our future even going to look like? Well, in their particular case, they had a really cool clue. And the clue to their future was based on God's promise. See, you could ask them while they're in Egypt, where are you going? Well, they'd say, some of them, well, I'll tell you, God made this promise starting with Abraham about moving to this other land, to Canaan, and that's where I'm going. See, a promise from God, especially since God is a timeless creature, it's not a matter of God kind of rolling dice and trying to figure out exactly where you're going to be. Since he's a timeless creature, he can actually look out over the landscape of time and tell you. So his promise is really, really good. It's like if I had a time machine, I could go off about a week in the future, read the newspapers, and come back and tell you what's going to happen a week from now. I could tell you who's going to win the Super Bowl. Like any of us care, unless you're a betting kind of person. But I mean, and I could say, I'll tell you who's going to win the Super Bowl. How do you know? Because I have a time machine. I have a way to be outside time, to come into time, bring it back in time. It's a cool machine. I can tell you without any doubt. Well, in a sense, God being a timeless creature, there is no gamble in his promises. He can tell them. There he goes. Time has no consequence. So when God promises, not only is he able to make things happen, in a way he's telling you what it's going to be, too. So it's very possible. So the connection between our past and our future and everything in between is a promise from God, is what they have. They've had that good news just like we have. That promise remains, but they still fell short. Now, in order to make this work for you, remember, you have to do one other thing. You have to build a bridge between the two. And you have to build it over the promise. Don't just build it anywhere you want to. You got to build it over the promise. And that bridge is faith. That bridge is faith. Faith coupled together with the promise, with that good news, is a way in which then what we do is we obey. And we say, now I can get from my past to my future, because through faith, which I've built over the promise, I can walk with confidence that that's where it's going to go. Rock solid. There's no question. Now, another thing you have to notice about faith, like a bridge, it's built on very sure moorings on both sides, especially on the left side. Faith is always a way to get from something to something else based on the solidity, is that a word? Yeah. The firmness of the anchor where you're coming from. If there's no anchor on the left side of that, your bridge is going to fall in the water. And if your faith is not built on something that it launches from, it's built on wishful thinking. That's what we call blind faith. Oh, well, it's going to happen. How do you know? Well, because I really firmly want it to happen. That's blind faith. There's no basis. There's no basis. But what is our faith built on here? It's built upon a promise, and it's built upon a track record of the one who made the promise. See? So in a sense, too, over here on the left, facts build a pier, a foundation of our past that you can build your bridge of faith upon. And that's just a huge, huge issue. Faith is not in contrast to the facts. Faith starts with facts. Now, what kind of facts should the Israelites have built their faith to start on? What kind of facts? What God already did. Exactly. What God already did. Now, in a few moments, they're going to leave Egypt. They're going to see miraculous plagues happen. They're going to see the Red Sea parted. They're going to be fed in the desert. And they can, on the left side, the pier of their faith, say, God has done this. He made a promise. Build my bridge. He'll be good on the other side. Because we're all idiots. I know. That's the amazing thing. How can that be? I know. And when you scratch your head for yourself, because we do the same thing. I many times when I'm looking into kind of a blue cloud, uncertain future, and I want to know what's going to happen, what I do is I go back and I say, well, wait a second. Let me take an inventory of what God has been in my past. God has been faithful here, and here. He brought me through this. He blessed me with that. I make a list. I start building my pier on the left to build my faith bridge on. I go, you know what? I've got an incredible God. Has he revealed to me in exactness the promise of where we're going? Well, not too much in specifics, but the promise I have from him is he loves me and he'll never forsake me. I'll build a bridge on that. I'll take him at his word on that because he's been faithful in the past. See? He's not, if he brought me this far, he's not going to drop me. So really, my faith, my expectation of what's going to happen in the future is built on a proclamation, a promise of who God is, and it's founded on the foundations of who he has always been, demonstrated, hard, and tangible. It's not based on a God I don't know. And by the way, you can't build any bridges of faith unless you know who God is. Why do you have any expectation that where he's going to take you, he's going to be faithful? You don't know anything about him. But if you do know God, if you've built a history with him, and God's eager to build that history with you, he wants you to build a bridge based on his track record. He doesn't want you to do blind leaps of faith onto a bridge that has no foundations. That's just nutty. That is just nutty. I'll say it again. That's just nutty. That's why in Christendom and in a lot of religions in the world, the concept of faith, the cosmic word of faith, is so badly misunderstood. It's seen as some kind of what I call cosmic religious gasoline. And if I have enough faith gasoline in my tank, I can do anything. Well, not really. The issue is faith is me taking God at his word to the degree he's revealed himself and what he plans to do. And I build a bridge on faith on that based on my expectation of who he will be based on who he was in the past. And I say, this is just reasonable. It's reasonable. But it all comes down to who I think God is. All of it. Just like for them, it all came down to who they think God is. And they didn't think he'd come good on his promise. See? That's the issue. It all comes down to who God is. It blows me away too. Well, to kind of fill this out too, our past has facts on it, and because of the promises God makes, the faith that we're willing to build to go across to there, we have a future, and as a result, we have a hope. So, I don't know how to say this any better, but faith is not an ungraspable concept. It's your decision to build a bridge that you can walk across based on the promises of God and who he is. That's all it is. It's as simple as that. You do it all the time right now. When someone commits to do something for you that's critical to you, you say to yourself, well, gosh, are they going to do that? Someone asks you, you think they're going to do that? And you say, well, yeah, I have faith in them. Why? Well, because they've done this in the past. We know what faith is. That's exactly what faith is. And that person's done it in the past, and they made a promise to do it in the future, and I think they're going to do it. So I will walk in expectation, and that's exactly what's going to happen, based on their character. That's all it is. Yeah.
In the Bible, what is the best definition of faith?
The best definition of faith that I've ever found is 5 chapters from now. 7 chapters from now. Cool. I know. The whole idea of faith, he brings it up right here, and he's going to develop it, and he's going to peek when we get to chapter 11. If you want to sneak a peek, read chapter 11. Ooh. Chapter 11 of Hebrews. Oh, it is. If you ask any Bible scholar, tell me the chapter you want to go to for faith, it's chapter 11 of Hebrews. So you're just getting primed right here. Just getting primed. Okay? All right, so let's move on. Let's try to apply this in their particular example. I had to move my peers up right here. The past and the facts that they had. Here we go. Verse 7, we already read it from chapter 6. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who factually brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Now, he's speaking in the future tense because he says when this happens, that's what you're going to remember. And by the way, when you read the story in the Old Testament about the nation of Israel and the relationship with God, do you know how many times God starts his sentences by saying this? I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. Now, he doesn't do that to brag. It's so you can build a foundation pier that your faith can come from. That's what he's trying to do. I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. So, and then he tells them a promise. And you keep your eyes open. You'll see this all the time. All he's doing is building a foundation pier for your bridge of faith. That's what he's doing. And that's what he's doing right here. They will come out, and they'll say, the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And now we need to build a promise in the next verse. The promise, verse 8, and I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession because I'm the Lord. It's back to who he is. I'm not a trickster. I haven't forgotten. I'm the Lord. I'm in control of things. And in fact, at the beginning of the fact pier, he says, I am the Lord. I am the Lord who accomplished this. I will do this. I am the Lord. You see the book ends right there? Because of who he is. So they build a bridge of faith between where they were and where they're going. And they say, there's giants in the land. We don't care. Because he's made a promise. Now, when the spies come back, 2 spies say, it doesn't matter. They don't contradict the factualities of what everyone said. But they do say, well, let's go in anyway. There's giants in the land. They don't debate it. Well, no, I think you sort of overblew with, they were tall guys, but they weren't really big guys. They don't do that. They don't contradict the facts. But they say, sure, there's giants. But hey, we got a promise. Who gives a care? I mean, come on. We had a promise. And our God is bigger than giants. Giants might be big, but our God's bigger. Now, they don't go through that whole rationale, but that's exactly what they do. There might be giants here, but God's promise is on top of those giants, and I can build a bridge of faith based on God's promise, and the giants will always be under the bridge. That's just the point. That's what Caleb and Joshua try and get across. But they get outvoted. And so an entire generation dies in the desert. And then it's a whole generation. If you knew whining, boy, you just don't know whining until you watch 40 years in the desert. So this is the way it works. This is what they should have done. And this is what God is trying to tell Moses to explain to them. At one point, after you see all these things, I am the Lord that brought you out of Egypt, and I will continue to bring you into the promised land. And after all, it would be silly for me, you can read between the lines, if God says, what would I be thinking if I got you out of the Egyptians and didn't finish the process and bring you to a home? You think I brought you out here in the desert to scuff around in the sand because I like to see your feet get hot? No, that would be cruel. And yet, you read the story. They get out in the middle of the desert and say, why did you bring us out here to die? We could have died in Egypt, at least where we had food. And they're saying, God, you did take us out of the you took us out of Egypt, but we don't think you're trying to take us to the promised land. We think you are so cruel, and this is Jim reading into it, we think you're so cruel that you freed us from the Egyptians, built up our hope, just so we can die in the sand. What kind of God is that? And yet that's what they claim he is. It's back to who God is all the time. And you can build a bridge of faith based on who he is and how he promises. Well, yeah, insulting to God. Yeah. Have you ever made a promise to someone and they tell you, no, you're not going to do it? Well, yeah, I am. No. Yeah. And again, let's not get too hard on the Israelites. The Israelites are idiots. Because we do the same. God has already made, that's what he's trying to say right here. He made a promise to them, and they didn't unite it in faith. God makes promises to you. We've had good news preached to us. But if you don't unite it in faith, if you don't think he's good to his promise, then what you're not saying is that his promise is bad. You're saying that he is bad. Saying he's a trickster. Does God love you? Doesn't he? And so when giants show up on your landscape, you say, God doesn't love us anymore. No, his promise is that he loves us and will never forsake us. That's the promise I use. And so I build a bridge of faith over the giants and say, yeah, but I have a bigger God than that. And he will never leave me or forsake me. And he loves me with a love that can't be shaken. Promise, promise, good news, good news, good news. You see it? But you still have to take some action and walk on that bridge. And that's where the rubber meets the road. Okay, let's push on. He says, I am the Lord here. He says, I am the Lord there. When you understand who makes the promise, then that's what fuels your faith. I just had to use some stuff on PowerPoint, so there you go. Okay? All right. He moves now into this whole topic of rest. And rest is a code word. It's a code word for life with God. That's all it is. It's a code. And he's going to talk about this. Now, Put on your Jewish thinking caps for a second here. I mean, it's the destination is what this is, life with God. Your Jewish thinking caps, because after all, this is a letter written to the Hebrews. And for them, the promise from God, the rest from God, was completely contained in moving to this promised land. But what about when you die and the resurrection and life after that? They didn't think too much about that, which is why even when you get to Jesus' time, there was speculation about whether there was resurrection even. The Sadducees said there wasn't resurrection. So their mindset was pretty much stuck on coming to this promised land, having this land of Israel be God's place. And there's nothing wrong with that because God promised that. But he's going to make a case right now to say that's too short. Yeah, we're on a sojourn in a way from one place to another, out of captivity here into a wonderful place over here. But it doesn't stop in the land of Israel. There's more life with God past that. And that's called rest. He's going to make his Jewish logical point right here. For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he has said. So remember, he's talking about the fact they didn't make it in because of disbelief, but we do make it in because of belief. Because we take God at his word, we take God at his promise. So now he's going to say this is a bigger issue than just living in Israel, because we have believed, and we enter that rest. Woo. Rest is life with God. Okay, here we go. Let's listen to his arguments. He starts quoting out of the Old Testament. God says in the first 10, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. He said that to the Israelites when they were on the brink of going into the promised land. So now we understand the promised land itself was, in a sense, was life with God. It was restful life with God in that promised place. He basically said, I'm going to make a land for you that you can go into. You'll have vineyards that you didn't plant. You'll have houses that you didn't build. I will provide these for you. It's a wonderful place of rest for you're my people. I'm your God. We can be together. Life together with God. And that's what he's talking about. The first idea of rest. But God said they're not going to enter my rest. Why? Because they disbelieved. And he goes on and says, although God's works, his works were finished from the foundation of the world. So remember, God makes creation in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rests, which means that he's all ready for us to enter his rest. There's nothing else he has to create. He's all set for us. Made the world, now he's resting, and he's waiting for us to join him in that rest. That's what he's saying right here. It's not that God has to hustle over and get things all ready for us and clean up the house. No, he entered his rest, now he's waiting for us to enter that rest with him. So he's starting to say, you know what? That this rest has been offered that started the day God finished creation. This offer of rest, life with God, has been offered. It's bigger than just the promised land. Anyone could have entered that rest starting the day after he finished creation. So God's waiting. He's just waiting. It's the point he's trying to make. It's sort of a timeless idea now. Verse 4, for he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. So it's all swept out and ready for us. It's all done. The work is completed. He's ready for us to join him in that rest. And again, in this passage, he says, they shall not enter my rest. And I think he's emphasizing the word my on that rest. He's not saying they shall not enter a rest. It's my rest. It's like God saying, I have this place called rest. It's where I am now that I've finished the busy work of all the creation. Now I'm free to just be with you. So that's the whole idea in the ancient times. When you worked the 6 days, you wouldn't see anybody because they were always just hustling to make food to stay alive. But on the seventh day, let's sit in the house, sip some tea, enjoy one another. It's really a whole idea of fellowship and being with people, unhurried, unburdened by life. It's a place where you see each other. It's like being on a holiday, is what we would say. You get away from all this stuff and there's a play. Well, he's saying right here in a cosmic, bigger sense, God has created a place that he's, I'll say it metaphorically, sitting, sipping tea and waiting to relate to you. Where he is not burdened with work, and neither should you. Rest is a place of relationship. That's what he's getting at. And God has had it all ready for you since the beginning of time. That was his plan. Seventh day, rest. Okay, I'd love to see you all when you get here. See, God's been waiting. That's what he's trying to say. And he'll make his case even firmer that it's an out-of-time experience. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience. By the way, disobedience, I thought he said he failed because of disbelief. Well, you do what you believe. They disbelieved God, so they disobeyed going into the land. That's why it kind of is a PS at the end of time. God will judge mankind based on what he does, not what he says, based on his actions. Because you do what you believe. You really do. I mean, they can't stand on the edge of the promised land and say, we believe God's promises, but we're not going in there. Because you don't believe them. You do what you believe. That's all he's saying. You do what you believe. Verse 7, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time, just as has been said before, today. This is from Psalm 95. If you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So was the rest of God, this rest that he entered into after creation, this rest that he said was what coming in the promised land was like, this rest that he promises to all mankind to have a relationship with a God who's not distracted by being a creator or busy doing all that other stuff. He's waiting to... It can actually be a place you can go to today. Today, you can enter that rest. Now, in a bigger picture, rest was going into the promised land, a place of God's provision for the people he loved. That's great, but that's more of like a real metaphor for the bigger rest of being in God's presence, which we as Christians call heaven. But he's also saying you can make the decision to go there today, and you can actually experience it today. He said, we enter our rest already. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, my Jewish friends, don't get stuck up on the fact that the Canaan, the promised land, Palestine, is the end-all, be-all. That was a great place God made for you. But there's a bigger rest coming. Today. Don't harden your hearts. Today. You can enter that rest right now. We go, yeah, I think I know what he's talking about. He's talking about that although there is a promise that I cross on my bridge of faith in the end of time to be with him and to be where he is and to relate to him, there's something about the fact that I can actually start doing that right now. And in the midst of living in a land of giants, I can have rest because God's promises are solid, and his presence is near. We can start the whole life of rest with God right now. It'll be consummated, after death and in heaven. I mean, it'll be even more, but you can start it right now. We enter that rest right now. Rest is a relationship with God, a putting off of works. He's going to talk about that now, too. Listen, he says in verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not have spoken of another day after that. See, the psalm written in the time of David, Psalm 95, said, today you can enter that rest. Well, if that was over here on the timeline, and yet Joshua brought them in the promised land way over here on the timeline, then Joshua didn't really bring them into the big rest. If so many years later, through the time of David in the psalm, he says, you can enter that rest today. See, he's making a really great Jewish case that rest, life with God is not just the promised land. It's the promised land, yes, but also life with God right now. In a spiritual sense, in a real sense. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And you know what else Jesus said? Come on to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you more work to do. I'll give you rest. Exactly. And he's saying that in the first person in the present tense. Right now. Right now. And it's all about what you do in terms of the promises of God and the character of God on your behalf. And if you believe that. Oh, this gives me goosebumps. Verse 9, so here's his conclusion. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. You think you got there when you moved into Palestine? Well, that was great. But there still remains a Sabbath rest, a time to put off your work and enjoy fellowship with God. Sitting around and sipping tea with the Creator and enjoying who he is and not being burdened by working or him being distracted by working. He said, there still remains a promise of a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And then he makes a very strong point. Verse 10. Listen, the one who has entered his rest, God's rest, has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. Now, hold on to this. This is a really cool point. If you want to enter the rest of God, be in his presence, then you've got to stop working too. Okay. Do we fail at that? Yeah. And they failed at that, he says. Well, no, wait a second. I thought they didn't get in because they didn't believe in who God was and God's promises, and so they didn't walk across the bridge in obedience, and they disobeyed. But he's saying there's something about the fact that they were still working in a way when they didn't go in the promised land. And this gets more to the key issue about how they could fail. It's because they were working in their minds. They weren't willing to go in and rest as they went in. They went in thinking work. Well, what are you talking about? Well, let's go back and look at the passage again. We're going to go back to the Old Testament here. The disobedience actually was they hadn't rested from their works. Okay, here we are. Rewind to, we got to that. Okay, they're on the verge of going in. Here we go. This is after the Numbers 13 passage I didn't get to. Caleb, one of the two spies who believed God's promise, Caleb quieted the people before Moses, and he said this: we should, by all means, go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. Now, he was actually resting when he said this. But look what they said. But the men who had gone up with him, that is the spies, the other 10 who didn't want to go in, said this: we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. Do you see the work part on their behalf? We are not able. Well, wait a second. Do you remember the promise? Did God say you are able? No. He said 1,000 times, it seemed like, I will, 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 I will. It's not, we're not able. They were looking at the edge of the promised land, and they were not willing to let God do it all. Because they stood there and said, we just can't do it. Stop trying to do it. And God said, I will. God will do it. God will do it. It's all done. So in reality, if they had stood at the brink of the promised land and said, we can't do this. And I think Caleb and Joshua said that, we can't do this. But hey, God will do it. So I can walk into this promised land with the giants and with all the problems that are there, resting, that is, dropping my own ability to try and do it for God, resting that He has it all squared away. And that's the primary reason for why we don't enter the rest of God. We don't enter a relationship with Him because we just can't do it. I'm too dirty. I can never make myself clean enough. Most religions say, if you want to get to the end of life, at the end of this place where there's wonderful stuff, you better darn well start working to make yourself clean enough. You better start working on it. And then work. And at the end of time then, you better hope you got it all worked out. You better hope you've done everything you can possibly do. Because if you don't, you're not going to make it in. And God just says, stop it. I will. That's why in Christianity we're so strong against the idea of working your way to salvation. Because the Israelites weren't expected to work their way to salvation. What they were expected was to trust the character and nature of God, walk on His promises, and let Him provide. That's the plan for them. And they wouldn't do it because they said, we're not able. But see, we do the same thing. We really do the same thing. Our relationship with God gets messed up when we try and earn His respect, when we try and earn our presence into His place, into that rest. Because we say, well, I think I'm finally good enough, God. I had a pretty clean week. I think I can be. And no. He takes care of that problem. He will, He has, it's done. That's the emphasis from the Israelites that we're supposed to learn. That's how we walk from day by day. Whew. Okay, one last P.S., and he does this to us. And, if you've been listening to this carefully, you should be a little concerned about your own heart. How do I know that my heart's in the right place? How do I know I'm not just one of the Israelites who said, hey, cool, we're out of Egypt. Hey, cool, we're crossing the Red Sea. Go in the promised land. No, got giants. How do we know where our heart's at? Because it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to discern. So he gives us one little tip on how to discern where your heart's really at. Find out where you're at. The Word of God. The Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of soul and spirit, of both joints and marrow, able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of Him with whom we have to do. The Israelites got to the edge of the promised land, and God looked in and said, I know your hearts. You're just not trusting me. You're trying to do this on your own. I want to provide. God sees. And if you wonder whether or not your heart's in the right place, God's word will show you. That book you've got in your hand, He's written so that you might start to understand. So where is my heart? Do I really trust Him? Do I really trust His promises? Do I really take God at His word about who He is and His ability to faithfully follow through on His promises to me? Do I really think God loves me? Read that book and start understanding. And you'll start to understand, I think I do know how much He loves me. How do I know? Because He came in the flesh as Jesus and died for me. Wow, He really, really loves me. So I guess I'll build a bridge of faith from that fact off into the future and where I'm going. With a God like that, man, what can man do to me? This is cool. You see? Use that book. It'll discern your heart. And he says it's so good at discerning your heart, it's like a butcher shop. It's like you can take this really sharp sword and kind of into the center of you and that place of your heart that's dark and mysterious and you can't really even tell what's down in there. You know, you fool yourself more than you fool other people many times. What the heck is in there? He says this word can pierce right in there. And it's so good it kind of exposes, it can even separate the subtleties of the spirit and the soul. I'm telling you, this is good. This word will reveal to you. God wants you to know where your heart's at. And He's given you this word to do that. To judge the thoughts and the intentions of the heart. There is no creature hidden from His sight, but all things are open and laid bare to the eyes of Him with them to do. There's a gruesome phrase in there, speaking of butchering. See that part about laid bare? Laid bare is used only here in the New Testament, the Greek word. But it's used in a lot of classic Greek literature. And to laid bare means literally to do this. Laying bare the neck. When you butchered an animal, a goat or a sheep or something like that, you would lay bare its neck. Yikes. I mean, no creature is hidden from His sight. All things are open and laid bare to the eyes of Him who has to do. There's a serious consequence going on here, judgment-wise. He sees, and the Word can see into who you're at and where it's going on. And it exposes your vulnerable parts. And there's judgment coming. And you don't want to be on the brink of the promises of God being fulfilled and say, I don't think I ever really fully believed that. Because the Israelites never fully believed that. And Moses tried to get them to understand that, and they didn't. And we saw it, I quoted it for you in Exodus 6. When He brought them the news, they said, we don't think so. They never fully believed that. I don't want you to get to the brink of God's promises being fulfilled at the end of all time and have you suddenly understand that I don't think I fully ever believed this whole story. Because that's what happened to them. How do we make sure that's not going to be the case? Right there in that book you've got. The Word of God. It's living and active. It separates between bones and marrow, between the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Get your life straight. Get your heart understanding based on that. And then understand who God is, understand what He's done on your behalf, understand He's made promises to you, good news made to you because He loves you. And you build a pier on this left side of my experience with God, and you build a faith bridge over to where He's going to take us. Because there's going to be giants between here and there. And you want to stay on that bridge. Now, we mentioned chapter 11 of Hebrews. Chapter 11 of Hebrews is all about the people in the Old Testament who built bridges of faith despite all the giants in their life. Because they believed in the promises of the one who made the promises and where they're heading. Oh, let's do 11 right now. Oh, we're out of time, okay? It's an incredible thing. And that's the kind of life He wants you to have as well. A life that takes Him at His word and delights in the fact that this God loves you and will do anything on your behalf. If you'll just stop working, trying to gain His pleasure. Just stop it. And then you can enter into the rest of God right now. Right now. This whole idea of rest and our ability to get there is going to be the theme from here for the next lots of chapters. Just a lot of chapters. But don't miss it. God has called you fundamentally to join Him at the end of creation, those 7 days, in a place where you can relate to him face to face, and he promises he won't be distracted by trying to keep the universe going because he's rested. It's an incredible promise, a promise of relationship with him. Okay, next week, we're going to take a look at chapter 5, and he's going to introduce this great high priest called Melchizedek, or a better pronunciation, Melchizedek. He's going to introduce him. And why Melchizedek? Oh, you're going to love this. You're going to love this. So we're going to look at Melchizedek as a form of who Jesus is and how it enables Jesus to get us where he wants to take us. Oh. And if you have training in the LDS Church on Melchizedek, this might really mess up your head. But this is from the Bible, so we're just going to stay straight with the Bible, okay? Yeah. Faith is the beginning of wisdom. Yeah.
Faith, the letters F-A-I-T-H, and forsaking all, I take him. Forsaking all.
Oh, that's cool. F-A-I-T-H, forsaking all, I take him.
I do not know where
That's nice.
I've had so many different passages.
Forsaking all, I take him. It's all about relationship with him. And his promises are good. Never have to doubt it. Forsaking all, I take him. Faith. Oh, we'll talk so much more about faith as time goes on here. This is faith. Oh, yeah, okay, let's quit. Yeah, PJ.
Fearsome, awesome, inspired, trustworthy, and honest.
That's PJ's F-A-I-T-H. Do it again. Do you remember?
Fearsome,
awesome,
inspired,
inspired, trust,
and honest.
honest.
That is honest.
Cool. I like it. He is trustworthy. And he wants you to understand in your present experience how trustworthy he is. He doesn't want you to trust him based on blind faith, but demonstrated faith. Okay. Father, we do indeed thank you for your great loving kindness shown to us in so many ways. And Lord, as we struggle with understanding how to build these bridges of faith based on your promises, not just our presumptions, but based on your promises, I pray that you'd give us an understanding of the huge foundation on that left side of the picture that we build that faith bridge on. The real demonstrated power and faithfulness that you exhibit on our behalf to clue us in about how we can trust you from this point and into the future.